All of us have no doubt played at least the mental game of, if you got 3 wishes from a genie in a lamp, what would those 3 wishes be? And if we just surveyed everybody here this morning, if we had you post it on the screen or fill out a form, there would probably be a lot of similarities. There'd be some overlaps in our wishes, our desires in that sense. And there'd be some differences as well, depending on age, stage of life, season of life, circumstances you find yourself in. If you find yourself in some financial struggle, then maybe that's going to be your wish. Like, I need cash, God, just cash would be, or maybe all of us would wish for that, right? Wherever we are, a little more cash is not a bad thing. And so maybe that would be for some of us, if there is a health issue that we're experiencing or somebody we care about is experiencing, maybe that would be, we kind of tilt in that direction. Just depending on where we are in life and kind of what's happening in this season would probably dictate what that wish or those wishes are going to be. If you've always wanted to travel to a certain place in the world, maybe, it would go that way. We'd all have different wishes. We're studying the life of Solomon. If you're new, I know a lot of people are visiting for Graduate Sunday. Welcome. Please come back anytime. We'd love for you to be with us anytime at all. We kicked off last week a study of the life of Solomon, an Old Testament character. Solomon has one of these moments in his life. He has a moment where he has to ask for something specific. God actually comes to him and wants to give him something and ask for Solomon's input. Like, what do you want? Which is a great question. What do you want? We're going to be in 2 Chronicles, in kind of the first part of the Old Testament. If you want to find it in your own Bible or your phone, it'll be on the screen as well. If you go to the Psalms, if you have a Bible in your hand, go to the Psalms, kind of the middle of the Bible, take a left, and you'll get to 1 and 2 Chronicles pretty quickly. We mentioned last week that there's some overlap between 1 and 2 Chronicles and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. We're going to bounce back to 1 Kings in just a little bit. When we get to this particular passage, 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1, Solomon is now king. We started last week with Solomon not yet king. Solomon's now king. There was kind of some turmoil. There was some tension in getting to that post, as sometimes happens. But 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1 tells us Solomon, son of David, established himself firmly over his kingdom, for the Lord his God was with him and made him exceedingly great. Little bit of a bumpy road. Like anytime there's a transition of power, especially if we're talking about more of a monarchy, a king, and we know that Israel was a theocracy, but it operated in a lot of ways like a monarchy with a king who made decisions and ruled and judged and that sort of thing. Whenever you have a transition of power in that setting, it's likely there's somebody else who wants that power. And Solomon experienced that, not to the same degree that David, his father, did, but he experienced some of that, other people wanting to slip in and get the throne before Solomon does. But when we get to 2 Chronicles chapter 1, he's there. God has put him there. He's firmly established himself as king. And what follows is Solomon wants to worship God. So he goes to make offerings at a place called Gibeon. At this time in the story, there is no temple. It hasn't been built yet. That'll be significant next week. Come back for that. There's not one place to go worship. There's multiple places all throughout the land that people are worshiping. Solomon goes specifically to a place called Gibeon, makes an offering of 1,000 burnt offerings, we're told, in this passage. And then verse 7, 2 Chronicles 1, verse 7 says, that night God appeared to Solomon, said to him, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Like not a genie. Didn't rub a lamp. There's no mythical character in the story. God shows up in the middle of the night and says to Solomon, ask whatever you want. Ask whatever you want. And some of us are thinking, man, tonight would be a good night for God to show up for me. Just ask me, God. I got some things. I got a lick. Whatever you want. God shows up. Whatever you want. And now this is kind of another message, but here's the reality. God does that for you. He does that for me. Like the Bible tells us that God says, make your request known. Now, come on, tell me. You have not because you ask not. Jesus says that. Yeah, you can tell me. You can tell me your struggles. You can tell me your hopes and dreams. You can ask. This is not unique to Solomon anymore. God does this for us. Now we learn in the next few verses that this is not a blank check. That God is not obligated to give us if we ask for the wrong things at the wrong time or with the wrong motives. Like God can't say no, but God comes to all of us in the way He did Solomon and says, I want you to ask. I want you to ask. I want you to ask with a pure heart and with the right motives. And then Solomon answers, and this is Solomon's answer. Solomon answered God, you have shown great kindness to David my father and have made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed, for you have made me king over a people who are as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me, this is his request, give me wisdom and knowledge that I may lead this people, for who is able to govern this great people of yours. Solomon asked for wisdom, nothing else. Not a 1B, not a 2 or a 3 or a 4, not a top 10. One thing, God, I want wisdom. Verse 11, God said to Solomon, since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth, possessions, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies. Now, maybe some of you would have asked for that. Shame on you. Since you have not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people over whom I have made you king, therefore wisdom and knowledge will be given you. You're going to get it. And I will also give you wealth, possessions, and honor, such as no king who was before you ever had, and none after you will have. God says, I'm going to double up here. I'm going to give you the wisdom that you asked for, and all those things you didn't ask for, I'm going to give you those too. I'm going to just pour into your life riches and wealth and possessions. God doesn't always do that. This is not like a promise of what God always does, but it's a reminder of something we just sang. When we seek the right things, God often adds more things. Jesus said, if you seek my kingdom first, I'll add all these other things. You don't have to worry about these other things. I will add everything else that you need. I will provide for you, as we sang just a minute ago, when your heart is right and set on me. And God does this. God begins to fulfill this promise. We get just a window, we get a highlight, a synopsis of it. Right after that in verse 14, we're told Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Did God keep his promise? The narrator says, oh yeah, he did. Yeah, God did what he said he would do. God provided 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horses. God's doing what he said he would do. Now, wisdom is not quite as easy to quantify. Wisdom is not as easy as saying 14,000 horses, 1,200 chariots. Like, it's hard to do the math on wisdom. Sometimes we know when it's there, but it's difficult to quantify. But we get these stories about Solomon. We get these stories about Solomon that affirm not only was God giving him wealth and possessions, but he was giving him wisdom too. Perhaps the best known story of this is in 1 Kings 3, a couple of books to the left if you're in 2 Chronicles. 1 Kings 3, you may have heard this maybe anecdotally, maybe you didn't even know this is where it was found or that it came from the Bible. There are two women, the Bible tells us they're prostitutes. They are living in a house. It's just the two of them, nobody else in the house. They each have a child. Tragically, in the middle of the night, one of them rolls over on her child who's sleeping with her, and the child dies, suffocates the child. The child dies. In the middle of the night, she wakes up, realizes her child is dead, puts her child next to the other mother, takes the living child and puts it next to her. Next morning, the other mother wakes up, and is frantic that her child is deceased now, but the closer she looks at this child, she knows this isn't my child. Mamas, you just know, right? You just know this isn't my child, and this obviously begins an argument between the two of them. It eventually lands in front of Solomon. They tell their story. One says, this is my child. The other says, no, this is my child. Her child is deceased. No, that woman's child. So it's just back and forth, and there's nobody who can provide any other testimony about this. Here's what happens. You may know the story. Verse 23, 1 Kings chapter 3. The king said, this one says, my son is alive and your son is dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive. Then the king said, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, cut the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. But the other said, neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two. Then the king gave this ruling, give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother. The mother, real mother, filled with compassion, not wanting to see her child harmed, said, no, let the child live, even if that means I don't get to keep the child. And this was Solomon's way of knowing, of saying, the living child belongs to that mother, the one full of compassion, not the one who is indifferent. He takes insight and applies it to a very complicated but very real story, a current story. This is what wisdom is. Wisdom is not just knowing things, not just an accumulation of knowledge, but it's knowing how to take that knowledge and apply it to real world circumstances, where the variables shift, where it's not a formula all the time, where it's complicated and it's he said and she said, and not all of the facts are really clear, but being able to take what is true and apply it to what's real, not just knowing things. It's practical application of truth. There are people who can solve problems in theory. They can solve problems on paper, but they're not real good at looking at real world events and trying to figure out how these things all go together. When you were in school, just like for me, you had to solve word problems, right? Anybody love word problems? Like, oh, that was my favorite. Just hope we get a word problem today. Math teachers, I see you. Yeah, you had word problems. One of the word problems we always solved was the one that went something like, there's a train that leaves a station at 9:30 in the morning going 80 miles an hour northbound, and then there's a southbound train that leaves another station at 11 going 50 miles an hour. Which of those two trains will get to Chicago first? And we all had to solve that. The problem was nobody cares. Nobody worried about a train. Like, here's what I guarantee you. Nobody's in Chicago this morning, which I love Chicago, great city, good pizza. Nobody's sitting in Chicago this morning at a train station going, man, just wonder whether that northbound or southbound is going to get here first. I think I'm just going to sit here and find out. And nobody's worried about it. Like, I know it teaches us math and there's a formula, and it's very worthwhile. Don't need any emails. It's very worthwhile to solve those. It just doesn't really apply to anything right now. The question is, can I take how I solved that problem and apply it to a completely different problem? Can I learn a process? Can I learn some truths from that I can begin to apply to other issues and circumstances in the world? Again, there are people who can tell you what you should do. They can tell you what worked last time. You meet these people? Well, this worked last time, let's just do that again. Yeah, what worked last time may not work in this situation. Wisdom is being able to bring what I know and put it into a new situation. Some of us, maybe all of us, there are certain tasks that we know a certain way to do them, right? And we do them that way every time. And somebody comes along and says, you know, there's a better way to do it. I don't want to know it. This is the way I do it. This is the way I do it. Don't talk to me. Some people learn a way to do it, and they follow step A, B, C, and D. Nothing wrong with that. That's just not wisdom. Wisdom is knowing this is true, this is real, this is right. There's a whole other set of variables now I've got to apply this to. Real life doesn't come at us like a word problem. Real life doesn't come at us this plus that. Real life always is a little murky. Right? The variables are shifting. This circumstance is similar to, not exactly like, that particular circumstance over there. Wisdom says we can apply what we've learned to a completely new situation. This is what Solomon had. He had wisdom, and people began to see it. After making this judgment in this case, verse 28, 1 Kings 3, we read, when all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe, because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. Everybody just knew. Everybody just knew. I think the hazer is still on. I hate to keep saying this. It may just be the AC. Sometimes the AC doesn't circulate. I just feel like I'm in a little bit of a fog up here. If it's still on, let's just kind of pull that back. Everybody just knew Solomon's wise. He didn't have to tell people he was wise. That's what I found about wise people. When someone has wisdom, they don't have to tell you they have wisdom. They don't have to go around saying, oh, you know, I'm really wise. You should talk to me about stuff. I want to give you some wise advice. No thanks. No thanks. Right? As a matter of fact, when somebody, if anybody tells you they have wisdom, stay away. Like, be leery of that person. The truly wise people, they don't have to tell you they're wise. You just go, oh, yeah. You watch their decision making. You watch the way they live. You watch their actions. People just know. Like in your office, wherever you work, whatever your business is, nobody had to say to you, okay, now, Stephanie's the really wise one. Like, if you got problems, Stephanie. Nobody had to tell you that. You're there a couple of weeks and you realize, like, everybody keeps going to Stephanie. For like the really big issue, Stephanie's door is always closed. You figure out Stephanie's the one to go to. You just know. Nobody has to tell you. And this is the way it was for Solomon. People just began to see. This guy has something. The Bible confirms it. Verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else. And this began to spread out even beyond the nation of Israel. We read, I'm not going to read the passage. It's in 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9. The queen of Sheba comes and says, I just got to meet this guy. I gotta ask this guy some questions. So she gives him all these questions. And she walks away going, they didn't even tell me the half of it. How lucky your people are. This is what the Bible says. Queen of Sheba says, how lucky your people are that they get to benefit from this wisdom. People just know. You just recognize it. You don't have to be in a room very long before you figure out, this is the one I need to listen to. Now, how do we get that? How do we become more like that person? How do we get wisdom? Well, there's really good news. There's really good news that we can actually gain wisdom. You can get more wisdom. No matter how old you are or how young you are, you can get more. No matter your past, your experience, you can get more wisdom. Young, old, in the middle, you can get more. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 5 says, get wisdom, get understanding, just very directly, go get it. Find it, look for it. Get wisdom. Now, the Bible's not going to tell us to do something that's impossible for us to do. The Bible's going to encourage us, go do this, it's possible. You can get wisdom, you can grow in wisdom. 2 verses later says, the beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom. Isn't that great? Like the beginning of what, if you want it, go get it. It's out there. God will give it to you. Get it. Keep growing. Keep learning. Get more wisdom. Proverbs chapter 1 Solomon personifies wisdom as a woman, and all the women said, yes, he did. Yes, he did. You know he did. Personifies wisdom as a woman, and he says, she's calling. Like, she's calling to you. She wants to be found. She wants you to have this wisdom. Wherever you go, wisdom is available. You can hear her. If you're listening, you can get more of her if you really want to get more. Now, how do we do that? First, in order to get wisdom, you got to realize you need wisdom. In order to get wisdom, you have to realize you need wisdom. God asked Solomon what he wants. Solomon says, I want wisdom because, like, who can lead all these people? I'm not capable of this job. Solomon's between the ages of 20 and 25 at this point. And Solomon looks at the task that's ahead of him and says, I have some inadequacies. I have some shortcomings. I can't do this job, God, unless you give me wisdom. The beginning of wisdom starts with knowing you need wisdom, not thinking you know it all. And not thinking you're the smartest person in the room. Having a humility that says, God, there is a gap between what I need and what I have. There is a gap between what I should know and how I should understand how to apply it and what I'm actually living in. God, I need more. Beginning of wisdom, just knowing you need it. Another thing, understand that God gives us wisdom when we ask for it. I mean, this example of Solomon, I said, it's not just for Solomon, it's for you. If you realize you need wisdom, step number one, say, God, I need wisdom. Give me some. I need it. Jump over to the New Testament in James, and James says, if anyone lacks wisdom, if you are smart enough to know you don't know it all, just ask God for it, because he gives it. He gives it. He's not mad at you for asking. He gives it in rich supply. He'll just give it to you. And if you feel inadequate, if you feel like you don't have enough wisdom, step one, realize that. Step two, ask God to give you some. And the Bible says he will, just like he did for Solomon. A third item, where else can we get wisdom? Wisdom comes from paying attention. It comes from paying attention. Time alone does not produce wisdom in the way that we sometimes think it does. Experience by itself does not produce wisdom in the way that we sometimes think it does. Sometimes we think, if I occupy space long enough on this planet, I will just get it. And that's simply not true. Time alone, experiences alone, even struggles, which is where many of us gain our wisdom, struggles and challenges by themselves do not give us wisdom. It's when we pay attention as we're going through those things and learn from those things that we gain wisdom. Listen, there's some very wise young and middle-aged people, very wise. Why? Because they paid attention as they were walking through life. And there are a few, maybe not, maybe there's some really foolish older people on the planet. It's not a matter of time. It's not a matter of age. Logging time on this planet does not produce wisdom. It is the person who pays attention to what they're supposed to be learning and how they're supposed to be growing. I think it was John Maxwell that I heard this saying. I don't know where it comes from, if not from him, but I heard Maxwell say many years ago, there is a difference between 20 years of experience and 1 year of experience 20 times. Some people, rather than having 20 years of experience, they didn't learn anything from the first year and they keep making the same mistakes they made in the first year. Or they make new mistakes they could have avoided if they had just paid attention. If they had learned something from that first, just logging time doesn't produce wisdom. It's when I'm paying attention. Solomon is credited with writing the book of Proverbs. The reality is, more than writing it, he probably collected it. This was common among kings of that time. they would, throughout their life, they would collect wisdom from different places and then would put it in a volume. They would put it in a book of some sort to then pass on to their children, to pass on to their people who would come after them. What that means is, as Solomon was having meetings with various people, he was paying attention to what they were saying. And when someone said something wise about finances, Solomon said to his secretary, write that down. Write that. I want to keep that one. When somebody said something wise about marriage, Solomon said, write that down. I want to look at that one again. All throughout his life, Solomon is gathering these pieces of wisdom because he's paying attention. He's listening. He's watching. What can I learn from this person? And what can I learn from that person? And maybe there's some things I can't learn from them, but there's a few things I can learn from them. I want to pay attention when he's walking through hard situations, struggles and challenges that we all walk through. He's not just complaining about them. He's paying attention to them. What do I learn by this struggle? What am I learning by this challenge? What am I learning about this heartache that I'm going through? He's paying attention. We've recognized our graduates, and a couple of weeks they're going to walk across another stage, and they're going to be done with high school. Never do it again, right? It's done. It's over. Some of them are going to go into college. We heard their wonderful plans. They're going to go to college. They're going to spend some time in the classroom. There's going to come a point where they are done with formal education. Done with it. In the rearview mirror. Benefited all they're going to benefit from formal education, but school's always in session, right? In this world, in life, if we want to grow in wisdom, school is always in session. There's always a way to learn. Pay attention when you're going through whatever it is you're going through. What is God saying to you? What are you learning? What are you gaining? We should never stop saying, you know, I never thought about it that way before. If it's been a while since you said, I've never seen it from that side before, you might want to pay attention a little more. If there hasn't been something in your life that you said, you know, when I was younger, I was convinced it was this way, and now I see it's more complicated than that. Now I see a different perspective. I see from somebody else's viewpoint, somebody who didn't grow up like I grew up, somebody who has a different background than I finally see a little bit from their perspective. I never thought about it that way. Like if you're not saying this on a regular basis, you're just not paying attention. Pay attention as you walk through life. Related to that, wise people are a source of wisdom. Not all people. Not every person you run into. A lot of fools in the world. But if you're paying attention, there's wisdom that will come from the people around you if you pay attention. Sometimes from unlikely sources. You didn't even think of that person as wise, and they spoke, and you went, I need to remember that. One of Solomon's Proverbs, he writes, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. Like when I talk to other people, when I get other people's wisdom, I grow, I learn some things. Wisdom is not a solo act. You're not just supposed to think of it all on your own. Wisdom's a group project. Hated those in school, didn't you? Unless you were the slacker and everybody else did your work. But most of us hated group projects because there was always a slacker and we had to do their work. Wisdom's a group project. Wisdom is, how can I get around people who see the world bigger than I do, who understand God better than I do, who know the Word better than I? How do I get around them and absorb some of their wisdom? One more thing. A diversity of interest leads to wisdom. And I want to talk about this for a long time, and we're out of time. A diversity of interest leads to wisdom. Finding wisdom is like being on a treasure hunt. Like it's turning over stones. It's looking in places you hadn't looked in before. 1 Kings 4, verse 32, describes Solomon like this. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. Solomon was a Renaissance man. He wasn't a one-track mind. You sit down with Solomon, you ask him about music, Solomon's got something to say. It's like, oh yeah, I've written some songs. I wrote some poetry. You ask him about building and engineering. Yeah, I'm working on some buildings right now. Let me tell you my thoughts on engineering and building. You're walking down the road and Solomon says, you want to know why that hyssop plant comes out of that wall? I can tell you. Like, he wasn't just locked into one thing. Solomon realized this world is bursting with wisdom to learn. And sometimes, especially as adults, we're like, this is what I do, and I'm just going to do that. I'm not interested in anything else. And God's like, man, I got such good things that you could grow, you could learn, you could know about if you wouldn't just be so one-track minded. A diversity of interests leads to wisdom. And yes, God ultimately gives wisdom, but He often gives wisdom through our curiosity. Us being curious about the world and the way it works and what He's doing. Again, our graduates are going to go to college. And they're going to sit in a class, some of them, and they're going to go, I want to be a banker. Why am I in English Lit class? Why do I need English Lit? I want to be an engineer. Why am I sitting in this art history class? You know, we have those conversations. I'm not defending everything about the American education system. Right? I'm sure there's plenty of things that need to be fixed. But sometimes we communicate to our kids, to our students, and our students absorb, I just got to get in, I got to learn my one thing, and I'm going to do that one thing for the rest of my life. Then you are going to be boring. You're going to come out on the other end a boring person. Sometimes a student is telling us something they're interested in, and our response is, you know, you can't make money doing that. And I know you got to make money because we got to pay bills and there's taxes and, you know, all of that stuff's got to happen. I totally understand that. But sometimes we can pursue interest for interest's sake. We can pursue things because it's a part of the world that God created, and God wants to show us. Maybe God's going to show you something about banking through art history. Who knows? Maybe you're just becoming more of a human by exposing yourself to more things, to learning more things, to having an imagination. That would be nice, right? Having a curiosity about the world that God created and put you in. You don't have to be one thing. You don't have to just choose one lane. God wants to expand who you are and your horizons. We're going to end with this. Chuck Swindoll wrote a little Bible study, and I'm kind of using it as we go through this service, just through this series, just as I'm studying. It's one of the resources I'm using. In that study, he quotes Frank Schaeffer, which is the son of Francis Schaeffer, if that name means anything to you, Christian apologist, philosopher from the 60s. Frank Schaeffer is his son. He wrote a book called Addicted to Mediocrity, and it's kind of a lengthy quote. I'm landing the plane, I promise. Stay with me. If from this world around us we can learn anything about God's character, surely it is that we have a creative God, a God of diversity. A God whose interest in beauty and detail must be unquestioned when one looks at the world which He has made around us and people themselves as a result of His craftsmanship. We could live in a flat, uninteresting world, one that had the bare minimum of gray ingredient to support life, one whose diversity was only enough to provide the minimum of existence. Instead, we live in a riotous explosion of diversity and beauty. We live in a world full of useless beauty. We live in a world of millions of species. We live in a world peopled by individuals of infinite variety, talents, abilities. And this is only on our own planet. When one looks heavenward and sees the complexity of the reaches of space above us, the mind boggles at the creativity of our God. Wisdom is out there. It's out there. It's calling to you. It's calling to you in various forms and from various places. Go get it. Go say, God, give it to me, and I'm going to go find where you hid it. I'm going to go find where you put it. Go get it. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom. God, we pray that you would come. You would open our minds to how you're trying to give us wisdom. Some of us are locked in, and we have responsibilities, and we have jobs, and there's bills to pay, and we just paid our taxes, and all of that's reality. Oh, but you're drawing our heart to be more imaginative, to be more curious, to ask questions, to talk to people who come from different places than us, view the world differently from us, to find out, God, how do you want to teach me wisdom through this person? How are you teaching me wisdom in my circumstances? Help us to get it. Help us to get wisdom, to keep growing. Wisdom's not measured by our age, our birth date. It's measured by how well we pay attention to what you're trying to tell us. In Jesus' name.